The 2003 Iraq War began under the pretext of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, but it quickly evolved into a mission to remove Saddam Hussein from power. For years, Saddam had positioned himself as a defiant symbol of Arab nationalism, surviving the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, UN sanctions, and multiple internal uprisings. But by the early 2000s, his grip on Iraq had weakened, and his international isolation had intensified. When U.S. troops entered Iraq in March 2003, the Ba'athist regime crumbled with surprising speed. On April 9th, Baghdad fell. Saddam's towering statue in Firdos Square was pulled down by American forces and jubilant Iraqis, a moment broadcast, globally, as the end of an era. However, while the regime collapsed, Saddam himself vanished. Intelligence indicated he had narrowly escaped airstrikes targeting him in the early days of the invasion. Rumors swirled. Some claimed he fled to Syria, others suggested he had gone underground, using decades-old escape routes built during his rule. With no verified sightings and no secure hold over the country's tribal or urban areas, the U.S. faced a dangerous power vacuum. Insurgent groups, many loyal to Saddam or fueled by nationalist resentment, gained momentum in the chaos. Saddam's disappearance became both a tactical headache and a psychological rallying point for anti-American forces. As the U.S. began its hunt, Saddam's face appeared on most wanted playing cards issued to troops, symbolizing the unresolved mission at the heart of the war. Despite their overwhelming military superiority, U.S. forces lacked the human intelligence infrastructure needed to navigate Iraq's social and political landscape. Saddam's survival tactics relied not just on physical concealment, but on deep-seated local loyalties, fear, and decades of authoritarian control. In rural areas near his hometown of Tikrit and across Sunni strongholds, Saddam was still seen, by many, as a protector against foreign invaders and Shia dominance. Locals who might have known of his whereabouts often refused to speak, fearing either Saddam's revenge or mistrusting U.S. intentions. This climate of silence and fear crippled early intelligence operations. Furthermore, the CIA and U.S. military were flooded with contradictory reports. Tips led soldiers on fruitless raids of abandoned farmhouses, underground tunnels, and desert outposts. Saddam's network had perfected the art of deception, spreading disinformation, leaking false locations, and staging fake movements to mislead trackers. Captured Ba'ath officials often claimed ignorance or gave conflicting stories under interrogation. Analysts began to realize that electronic surveillance and satellite imaging were of little use against a man hiding in a landscape of family ties, tribal codes, and oral communication. The turning point would not come from technology, but from a slow, methodical breakdown of Saddam's support network, a grinding, ground-level intelligence war that would test American patience and persistence over the next 8 months. After months of dead ends, the U.S. intelligence strategy shifted. Rather than chasing vague sightings of Saddam, Task Force 121, an elite unit composed of CIA operatives and special operations forces, began focusing on dismantling his inner circle, one person at a time. The logic was clear. Saddam was likely being protected by a shrinking circle of deeply loyal individuals, most of them drawn from his hometown of Al-Auja and surrounding areas near Tikrit. The key wasn't finding Saddam directly. It was getting to the people who knew his habits, patterns, and hiding spots. Over time, relentless raids, interrogations, and detainments began to pay off. In particular, a series of arrests in the Samarra-Tikrit region put immense pressure on Saddam's tribal network. Dozens of former bodyguards, drivers, and logistical aides were taken in. The turning point came when U.S. forces captured Muhammad Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit, one of Saddam's closest bodyguards. He initially gave nothing away. But after intensive interrogation and careful psychological pressure, alongside promises of protection for his family, he broke. He provided a name, Qais Namouk, a trusted associate still actively delivering food and supplies to Saddam. This small breakthrough shifted the entire operation. Surveillance on Qais eventually led to a specific location, a modest farmhouse outside Ad-Dar, just south of Tikrit. The CIA believed Saddam might be hiding nearby, and the clock began ticking. The information was considered credible but incomplete. Before launching a high-risk operation, U.S. forces needed to be absolutely sure. With fresh intelligence pointing to 2 potential sites, U.S. commanders initiated Operation Red Dawn, named after the 1984 American film depicting a resistance movement against an occupying force, an ironic nod to the shifting dynamics in Iraq. The operation was led by the 1st Brigade of the 4th Infantry Division, with support from Task Force 121. The intelligence identified 2 rural farmhouses near Tikrit, codenamed Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2. The plan was to strike both sites simultaneously to prevent any possible escape. On December 13, 2003, at approximately 8:30 p.m., U.S. troops launched the raid. Nearly 600 soldiers and special forces operators surrounded the area, securing a tight perimeter. Initial searches of the houses revealed no weapons caches or signs of Saddam. It was only when soldiers noticed a patch of earth that seemed slightly disturbed behind one of the farmhouses that suspicions peaked. Beneath the soil, hidden under styrofoam, carpet, and bricks, was a narrow shaft leading to a 6-foot-deep underground hideout, a so-called spider hole. A soldier descended and found a man lying in the dirt, disoriented and armed only with a pistol and 2 AK-47s beside him. He was pulled out without resistance. Though he looked drastically different, bearded, aged, and wearing a simple, disheveled shirt, the troops quickly confirmed the unbelievable. They had found Saddam Hussein. His first words, calmly delivered, were, "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, and I am willing to negotiate." But there was no negotiation. He was captured alive and taken into custody, marking the end of one of the most intense manhunts of the 21st century. The world was stunned when news broke that Saddam Hussein had been found alive. After months of speculation that he might have fled the country or been killed, the image of the once feared Iraqi dictator being pulled from a dirt-covered underground cell was both shocking and symbolic. U.S. troops had uncovered what appeared to be a crude yet effective hiding place, a spider hole, measuring only a few feet wide and hidden beneath a pile of debris in a remote rural area near Tikrit. It had been carefully camouflaged with earth, bricks, and foam, making it invisible to aerial surveillance and even nearby ground searchers. Saddam was found with a pistol and 2 rifles beside him, but he offered no resistance. His appearance was a stark contrast to his once imposing image: unkempt hair, a long graying beard, and a filthy face marked by months in hiding. The psychological blow this delivered to his remaining supporters was enormous. He no longer resembled the grandiose figure from state-run propaganda videos. He looked defeated, isolated, and vulnerable. U.S. forces quickly confirmed his identity through biometric tests and DNA samples, leaving no room for doubt. Shortly afterward, U.S. Administrator Paul Bremer addressed the press with the famous words, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got him." The footage of Saddam undergoing a medical examination, his mouth being checked like a prisoner, not a president, circulated globally. For the Bush administration, this was a defining victory. But while Saddam's physical capture was complete, the battle for Iraq's future was far from over. Saddam's capture sparked immediate reactions around the world. In the United States, President George W. Bush hailed it as a major milestone in the mission to liberate Iraq. His approval ratings temporarily spiked, and media outlets across the West framed the event as a decisive blow to tyranny. The Bush administration emphasized that justice had caught up to Saddam, using the moment to validate the 2003 invasion, even as questions over weapons of mass destruction still lingered. In Iraq, the response was more complex. Scenes of celebration erupted in Baghdad, especially in Shia and Kurdish neighborhoods that had long suffered under Saddam's brutal rule. In contrast, some Sunni communities, particularly in Saddam's home regions, met the news with mourning, skepticism, or fear of what would come next. For many Iraqis, Saddam's capture did not mean safety or stability. Insurgent violence continued unabated, and the power vacuum left by Saddam's absence only fueled further chaos. Internationally, governments that had supported the invasion welcomed the news as a step toward rebuilding Iraq. However, critics of the war warned that Saddam's capture would not solve the deeper problems: sectarian divisions, lack of political infrastructure, and growing anti-American resentment. Moreover, insurgent leaders swiftly pivoted, portraying Saddam's capture as irrelevant or even beneficial, claiming that it would allow the resistance to flourish without being tied to an outdated dictator. Despite these tensions, the propaganda value of Saddam's capture was immense. The image of a defeated despot being dragged from a hole served as a cautionary tale for other authoritarian rulers, while offering symbolic closure for victims of his regime. Yet behind the spectacle, Iraq was spiraling into a more complex and deadly conflict, one that Saddam's capture alone could not end. Following his capture, Saddam Hussein was transferred to a secure U.S. military facility near Baghdad, where he was interrogated by American officials and later handed over to Iraqi authorities. But rather than being tried at the International Criminal Court, the U.S. chose to establish the Iraqi Special Tribunal to try him under Iraqi law. This decision was meant to give Iraqis ownership of the justice process, though it was also criticized for being politically influenced and rushed. The most publicized of Saddam's trials was for the 1982 massacre of 148 Shia men and boys in the town of Dujail, a brutal retaliation after a failed assassination attempt on Saddam. Throughout the proceedings, Saddam remained defiant. Clad in a dark suit, he often shouted in court, declared himself the rightful president, and dismissed the tribunal as illegitimate. Still, in November 2006, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. 3. Execution was carried out on December 30, 2006, just before sunrise. Footage of the event, filmed on a smuggled cell phone, was leaked and widely circulated online. The video showed Saddam being taunted by guards moments before his death, a deeply controversial detail that reignited sectarian anger. While many Shia Iraqis and Kurdish survivors of Saddam's regime celebrated the hanging as a form of long-overdue justice, others, including Sunni communities and human rights organizations, criticized the manner and timing of the execution, warning it would deepen divisions and fuel further instability. Saddam's death marked the definitive end of Ba'athist rule, but it did not bring the peace many had hoped for. Instead, Iraq continued to fracture, plunging deeper into insurgency, sectarian warfare, and eventually giving rise to groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later evolved into ISIS. The capture and execution of Saddam Hussein remain one of the most iconic episodes of the Iraq War and the broader War on Terror. For the United States, it was seen as a tactical and symbolic victory, the removal of a dictator who had long resisted Western dominance in the region. It showcased the capabilities of U.S. intelligence and military operations, and briefly restored confidence in a war that was beginning to unravel politically and morally. However, the aftermath revealed the limitations of military success when not paired with a coherent political strategy. Saddam's removal created a dangerous vacuum in Iraq's fragile society, one that U.S. planners had not adequately prepared for. As institutions collapsed and sectarian militias gained power, Iraq slid into chaos. The belief that toppling Saddam would automatically lead to a peaceful, democratic Iraq proved tragically flawed. Moreover, the operation highlighted the crucial importance and difficulty of human intelligence in modern warfare. It wasn't satellites or drones that led to Saddam's capture, but a methodical breakdown of his tribal and personal networks. This insight would go on to shape U.S. counterterrorism strategies in future conflicts, from Afghanistan to Syria. Historically, Saddam's downfall is a case study in both the success and failure of regime change. His capture closed a bloody chapter in Iraqi history, but it also opened the door to new forms of violence, extremism, and foreign interference that haunt the region to this day. His story remains a warning. Removing a tyrant is not the same as building a nation.